Welcome back to 6 Minute Sessions. My name is Jonathan Sixtos, professional educator, licensed and ordained minister. And what we do in this podcast is we talk about some topics dealing with life, specifically education and ministry, my areas of expertise. And if you joined us for the premiere episode, we are talking about a teacher's thoughts on 2 years of COVID-19. So as many of you are wrapping up your spring break, you are enjoying your time off and getting ready, if you're like me, to go back to school. Our state tests are coming up here shortly, but we can think back, and many of us do, in fact, remember how spring break looked a little different 2 years ago, looked a lot different 2 years ago. And what happened was we faced the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic when it reached the United States. Now, again, most of my perspective, most of the things that we talk about come from American public education, come from American experiences. I understand that COVID-19 was already prevalent all around the world. And so what we're looking at now is when we were anticipating what many of us call March Madness and the NCAA men's and women's basketball tournaments, and those were called off. And we were looking at the NBA season suddenly being cut short, and unfortunately our school year was also cut short. So last time I talked a little bit more about the systemic problems that we saw and how we're dealing with that, but today I want to take a few minutes of your time and talk about the emotional component and what it felt like as an adult, as an educator, as someone charged with taking care of children and their educational needs, but also sometimes many times their social and emotional needs as well. And as I was meditating on what to say through this episode, I think the best way to describe it would be almost like a death in the family, a strange grief, a weird loss. And to this day, many of my students, they're seniors now, they come back and visit and they reminisce about the freshman year that never finished, the time that we didn't get to spend with each other. And I feel like many of our students around the country haven't had time to properly process that grief. Now, it wasn't regret as much in something that they did miss because no one got to finish the year, and it wasn't remorse because they did something wrong. And I think that's what confused a lot of our students and a lot of our adults. Normally, whenever there's an end to something, we can pinpoint, okay, this is the problem, this is at fault. But there was no person whose fault it was. There was no natural disaster. Normally, when we see a hurricane in South Texas approaching, we have time to prepare for the event, and then the event happens, and then we immediately begin the rebuilding phase. That's how I remember much of my community responding to Hurricane Harvey. But with this pandemic, it was unlike any natural disaster that we had seen before. There wasn't an event. It was mysterious. It was an interesting experience because we didn't quite know how long it was going to take. Many of you probably recall the phrase 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And it's been 2 years. So many of my students, and I brought this up the other day in the classroom and we talked about it. And I said, guys, how many of you ever took time to actually grieve that lost school year? Because we didn't get to finish the last 1/4 of the school year. The proms didn't happen. The graduation parties didn't happen. The baseball games didn't happen. The basketball playoffs didn't happen. The soccer season playoffs didn't happen. And kids felt that loss, but they were immediately told, all right, here's the next thing. Let's buckle up and let's go. And we as educators, we adapted, we were resilient, we were strong. But I hesitate when I think of how have we dealt with what was. Now, the last episode, I talked about how we dealt with moving forward and how we've recovered and how we have reached out to our students and met their needs. But I think we should take some time and think about what was lost and appreciate that. And the kids told me when I brought this up with them, they said, we really haven't had time because immediately it was, all right, we're going to switch to this online thing. This is what we're going to do. We're just going to keep moving. We're just going to keep surviving. And then when we came back, and many people across the country, it was fully remote. And we were adapting and saying, this is the new normal and this is what we're going to have to do. And we're just going to keep everybody safe and we're going to keep surviving. And now as we gradually begin to ease out of statewide restrictions and nationwide restrictions and numbers begin to change, again, we grieve the loss of life. We acknowledge and we admit that the virus is dangerous and deadly and still out there. But as we nationwide continue to move forward, I think it is important that we look back. And I want to encourage those of you, take some time, maybe do a little journaling, some meditation, and think about what was lost. Because I feel like it should be appreciated. It should be memorialized. It should be thought of so that as we move forward, we can remember what it felt like. My students felt that loss, and it was weird. It was strange. Like, well, whose fault is it, Mr. Sixtos? Well, I don't know. Well, how long is this going to take, Mr. Sixtos? Well, I don't know. And that uncertainty compounded that fear of an unknown assailant, this virus that completely changed our system of education. It completely changed our culture. It brought out the best in people, and it brought out the worst in people as well. But I wanted to take a few minutes of your time today and let you know that as an educator, as a teacher, I can guarantee you that I'm not the only one, and my students are not the only ones who felt this loss. So take some time today. Maybe write things down. Maybe talk with your kids about it and say, hey, what did it feel like when your year was taken away from you? And they'll be able to share. We'll be able to process, and we'll be able to continue to move forward. And that's going to wrap up my teacher's thoughts on 2 years of COVID. We talked about the system. We talked about the emotional toll that it took. And as we move forward, the next time we're going to be talking about a minister's thoughts on COVID-19 and how it has impacted my local church specifically, but also many of our local churches across the country and some around the world. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you next time.